Hello and welcome to History 215 Online. Today we're talking about Chapter 4 and it is entitled Expansion and Control. And we are talking about expansion and control between the 1700s and 1763. The North American colonies developed a stable manufacturing economy that could potentially rival many European nations. So that's what we're talking about today, and how they went about doing that, and how actually slavery was a huge piece of this market economy. Okay. First we need to talk about that there were four areas, of course, in colonial America. You have New England, which would be Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut. You have the middle colonies, which would be New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Chesapeake. And then the Chesapeake colonies, which would be Virginia and Maryland. And the southern colonies, which would be North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay. We also need to talk about our learning objectives for this week, or for this chapter, rather. Describe the development of the English colonies during the 1700s, including a discussion of each group of the colonies: New England, middle colonies, Chesapeake, and southern colonies. Discuss the impact of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening on colonial America. Chronicle the development of slavery in the American colonies and analyze the reasons for changes in attitudes and in the legal system that helped the distinctly American slave system flourish. By 1763, American colonists had become used to making their own decisions and taking care of their own needs. Describe the events in England that contributed to this situation and explain their effects on the colonists. What you need to know about these different colonial sections, which we just discussed, New England, middle colonies, Chesapeake, and southern colonies, is they each were very different. They each grew something very different. They each had a different kind of a crop, different kind of society. They really were very regional in nature. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is New England. They were very diversified. They had many different things that they farmed. Very highly agrarian. In this section, it talks about triangular trade. The New England colonies traded fish and grains to England and Southern Europe for wine, spices, and gold. They sold their goods to the West Indies, and then it kind of make this triangular trade going around between, if you just read the definition of triangular trade: pattern of trade in which fish and grains, spices, sugar, ships, slaves, and gold were traded between the New England colonies, England, Southern Europe, and West Indies and Africa. Okay. Let's see. I really do want to talk about sons. Okay. Something really amazing about the Americas that the Americas really drew people to from England was, let's say you were one of 6 sons. If you were the first son, your life was pretty much made because you got the whole inheritance, you got all the land, okay? But if you were son number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you'd have to take up a trade or be a soldier, which was not a really good thing in Europe. They weren't the greatest guys, that changed over time. That was just kind of an option, or their only option that they had. Many times soldiers way back in the day really were known for looting and that sort of thing while they were fighting. Okay, so they were not, the merits of being a soldier today, of being a gentleman, of doing the right thing, or a woman who's a soldier, doing the right thing, being, being both mentally tough, fighting for their country and their sacrifices, is much, much, much different than what a soldier was hundreds of years ago. Okay, it's completely different. It's really changed. And it's been based on the merit system, which had a lot to do with the Americas when soldiers came to the Americas. Okay, so when all these sons were being born here in America, this same kind of English mentality was going through, their minds, where you would not divide the land up 6 different ways. Okay, but what was happening is land was opening up. out west, and each one of these sons could actually get land and have, wealth or a place in society, because land really was your place in society, and it was kind of tied to your wealth and your value as a human being for a man. Women, not really able to own property. There were a few instances, not very many at all. Women were property, okay, once you were married. And especially in the New England colonies, Puritanism was extremely, strong, and women really just didn't have a voice at all. They were considered property, and you could not be a single woman. You had to be controlled by a son if your husband was dead, by your father if you were younger, or by a husband. You didn't really have choices or agency or a voice. Okay. So when America opens up and all these, different sons have an opportunity to have what the first son has, that's really important, okay? Because in England, in the European, countries, that's, land was really scarce, and they didn't want to split it up and that sort of thing. So I have 3 sons. And so, our mentality here in America today is they each have an equal opportunity to succeed. All right. And that's kind of what the Americas kind of meant to, son number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay. So some of the things we need to talk about New England, sorry. All right. Very, very Puritan. Okay. Jeremiad is a long speech or literary work emphasizing society's fall from purity and grace in its current depraved state. The Puritan society was really kind of crazy, okay, because it was all about being super pure in order for God to bless. And so in order to do that, instead of kind of focusing on your own individual purity and, okay, how am I doing? What's on my plate? Judging yourself. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of encouragement to spy on your neighbor, see what they were doing, tell on them. The more you told on your neighbor, the more you spied on your neighbor, the more you saw their wrongs, the more that you were getting your community to be that city on a hill. So that really made for not a great close-knit, loving society, because it was all kind of, judgmental and telling on each other. Another piece of this is this manufacturing and this economic boom in New England. New Englanders began to try to merge, Puritan ideas with some things that weren't really accurate. And one of those was, if you're wealthy, then God likes you and God's blessing you. Okay, but honestly, that's not really in line with biblical principles, because, if you look at, the origins, Jesus didn't have a house. He did not own a house. He had nothing. His disciples had very little. They kind of lived day to day. So this ideology that the richer you are, the more money you make, that's God blessing you, really doesn't go hand in hand. It's more of a greedy kind of Christianity. And, Puritans were really buying that. And so then the people within these different towns and cities of New England were saying, hey, if this is what we say now, that if you're rich, God's blessing you, then you need to listen to us, the powerful men who are rich. And it was kind of a mindset, an argument mindset that was kind of perpetuating itself and giving people power that wanted it. But that's not really the basis of Christianity, okay? The more wealth you have, because if you look at the different verses, obviously, it says it's more difficult for a rich person to be Christian. There's different verses. It's like a camel going through the eye of a needle. So this is kind of conflict here. It doesn't really match up with what Christian beliefs really say, but it's a societal, religious thing that they're just kind of embracing. I don't know if it made any sense, but hopefully it did. Okay, so the middle colonies, we talked about what they were. they owned their own furniture, and they produced their own furniture in the middle colonies. They had a lot of agriculture implements, and they spun their own. Had a lot of textiles, spun their own flax and wool to make clothing. And they began making houses out of bricks. So you can see that there's a different characteristic in each one of these colonies that's quite different. There was a sexual division of labor. Women were controlling the indoor activities and men controlling the outdoor activities. All right. And then we had Chesapeake. Their economy was chiefly based on tobacco, okay, and it grew quite well in this area. Society, really a lot of English gentry. All right. There were many more men than women in Chesapeake, so women had a little bit of a window or opportunity to have more choice in who they married, and were able to pick people who would possibly treat them better, which is really interesting. Okay, indentured servitude did take place for quite some time in the colonies. You have to understand, though, both men and women came across, and for 7 years they were indentured servants and or more or whatever. But you have to really understand that there were a lot of corruption in these as well, because you're sending a daughter over to the United States without any protection of a husband, without any protection of a father or a son. So they had a lot more freedom and agency, but also there were people who had indentured servants that treated them horrifically because they had nowhere to go. Also, if a woman, wanted to marry during the indentured servant time, they could not. They had to wait until it was up, which would make them marrying later. And if they became pregnant, their babies could actually be taken from them, and because they were still under that indentured contract. It was really case by case, but it was not a pretty situation if that happened. And also there were some abuses of masters and their indentured servants. Also, if there was huge abuse, these indentured servants could escape, and they could go to a different town, and they could start over, or that sort of thing. And they really kind of could blend in because they were white Europeans. Also, with Native Americans, you have a lot of Native Americans were made kind of slaves, and then they could escape. They knew the land. Well, when you talks about later about slavery, you're bringing Africans over, okay? Their color, they stood out, and they could not escape. There was no place. They were absolutely trapped. They couldn't go back to Africa. Many times they couldn't speak the language. And, just thinking about that slavery really, just your color identified you as a slave, really made it even more tragic. Okay. Southern colonies really was based on the economy of tobacco, rice, and indigo, and then cotton later. Honestly, slavery may not have been as big in the South had Eli Whitney not invented the cotton gin. Once he invented the cotton gin, it took off because it really helped with manufacturing of cotton and separating the different things that are in cotton when you pick the cotton plant. And then slavery was in much higher demand. And the South could not live without slavery because no white European, male or female, wanted to do the grueling work that cotton required or rice required. So that is really, you really have to look at that. Free labor was slavery. Okay. Very humid, heat, insects in the South. Elite, Southern whites, that plantation atmosphere. Okay. Slave codes. Really, please read about your slave codes. Let me check and see what page that's on. All right, there's a section on slave codes. Just really, the codes for slavery were absolutely just eye-opening. All right. We'll probably have a section where we do read about the slave codes. Okay. You have Enlightenment coming. You have some famous American Enlightenment thinkers, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Paine. Okay, we talk more about African slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, absolutely